Welcome everyone to the Jupiter workshop, Truth or Dare. This is part of the complete course that I am teaching, the diploma program. So you can join this workshop independently, as many of you have done. But if you're interested in the greater program, you can visit my website and get all the information. So I'm teaching this, it's November 2019, and this is the last month that Jupiter is actually in its own sign of Sagittarius, about to move into Capricorn. And the coming year is going to be very interesting because Jupiter is going to make very powerful aspects with other planets. Namely, Pluto. We're going to have a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction next year and a Pluto-Saturn conjunction. So this is, material that's going to be available beyond this particular year, but it will be nice for us who are live in this presentation to be able to relate that to our own personal experience. Those of you who watch this video at a later stage, you can reflect back on the year 2020, and how those big players, Jupiter, Saturn, Jupiter, Pluto, manifested in your life. So, as you know, Jupiter rules the sign of Sagittarius. Before the outer planet were discovered through telescopes, Jupiter also ruled Pisces. Some people still use the traditional rulers. I prefer to use the modern ruler. I see them as more comprehensively reflecting the energies of those signs. So I would see Neptune as a main ruler of Pisces. But we will touch on that. So Jupiter is a, well-documented, quite well-researched planet in astrology. It's the largest planet, obviously. So even ancient cultures were very familiar with Jupiter. There are many different myths and stories associated with Jupiter. And the most common association with Jupiter is the sense of expansion. It's that benevolent quality that Jupiter provides, growth and basically a sense of expansion and receiving good things from life. So that's the Santa Claus of the zodiac. But in many ways, Jupiter can be a big ego booster. But we're going to see that obviously there are many layers to that. So everybody's looking forward to their Jupiter transit, and everybody's, wanting to get some confirmation that we're on the right track. So it's kind of harvesting the things that are available for us. So in the course of this presentation, what I would like to do is review some of these old themes, the things we already know, most of us, about Jupiter. If we've been around astrology long enough, we've certainly used it a lot. So we're going to review that, but hopefully we're going to tie it into the more complex paradigm that Jupiter represents. And then what I would like to do is also apply Jupiter in every sign. See, once we have our keywords, how it really works in the different signs and houses, and then explore the different planetary cycles, like we said, Jupiter, Pluto, and so forth. I will also discuss Jupiter with some of the asteroids because it's part of the mythology, and we'll see that it's important. So the astronomy of Jupiter, it's the largest planet, and it's not just the largest, it's 2.5 times as massive as all other planets combined. So it's big. It's very visible with the naked eye. It's one of the interesting sights to follow Jupiter in the sky. There's a red spot on the surface of Jupiter, which is a storm that has been identified since we've had telescopes in the 16th, 17th century. And that storm is 3 times the size of the Earth. Jupiter has many moons, different accounts, but I think the latest update is 79 moons, and the largest ones are Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. One day on Jupiter is only 10 hours, which means Jupiter spins on its own axis in 10 hours, which is really fast considering its size. And it's the fastest in the solar system. The other interesting thing is the gas giant with Saturn. The two largest planets in the solar system are Jupiter and then Saturn. So it has no solid surface. Like if you were to travel to Jupiter, there would be nothing to walk on. And yet it has an incredibly powerful gravity pull. So maybe it's related to the fact that it spins so fast. It's like a super powerful magnet in the in the solar system, and that's why it attracts a lot of comets and asteroids um, impacting its surface. So the way scientists have determined, where does Jupiter begins and ends, because if it doesn't have anything solid and it's just gas, then how do you know how big it is really? And their reference is that they use the beginning of the Earth reference of gravity. So they compare, what we experience here, and they project that on Jupiter to determine kind of a starting point. So these are just general themes, and these are some images of Jupiter. You see here that massive red spot, which is that storm. That's its pole, and you see, incredible images, really very artistic, and you see those, morphing shapes that have been taken by, a recent visit to Jupiter. Um, so it does look very fluid, very gassy. There is a sense that it's not very firm and solid. On the bottom here, you see its largest moons, Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, and Ganymede is the largest of all. These are the 4 moons that Galileo first identified, because Galileo, is the father of the telescopes. So he's the first one to really put a telescope together and start to see what's out there in the world. And he identified, the first four moons, which are the largest ones, called the Galilean moons. So, as you probably know, Jupiter is the Roman name for the Greek god Zeus. And as I said, because Jupiter is so visible, it has been identified by many cultures before the Greek and before the Romans, and beyond that as well. So in Norse culture, Jupiter is Thor. That's why it's related to Thursday. And it's a protective god. The Norse are pretty rough gods. And in Babylon, it's the god Marduk, which is actually a much softer version of Jupiter. King of all gods, presiding over justice, fairness, healing. So even the healing quality to Jupiter in that sense. But in all the mythologies, in the Greeks and the Babylonian, it's a big presence. It's the big, it's the god of all gods, the king of the gods. So it's presiding over everyone else. And so it was in the Olympian pantheon of the Greeks. Is Jupiter was the leader of the Olympus. And yet it's interesting. In astrology, we have the sign of Sagittarius, Capricorn, and then Aquarius. So we go counterclockwise from Jupiter, Sag, Saturn, Capricorn, and Uranus for Aquarius. But as far as the chronology in the Greek myths, the first god was actually Uranos, and he was the sky god who mated with Gaia, the earth goddess. So the whole concept of Father Sky and Mother Earth is very much, depicted in this story of Uranus, the sky god, and Gaia, the earth goddess. And they had quite a tumultuous relationship. Every night, Uranus would rape Gaia. And eventually they fathered, they had many children, but there's that tension between the sky and the earth. And even though it's a marriage between both, it's not an easy marriage. It's a lot of friction and violence. But it's interesting in our modern time, especially today, as we have the planet Uranus going through the sign of Gaia, Taurus, and you see that Taurus squares Aquarius in the natal chart, which is the earth and the sky. You see that today also technology and the virtual world and this very fast and progressive qualities of Uranus can very often affect the earth very dramatically. We feel that progress and technology is raping nature, raping the earth, that we're polluting, that we are, spilling substances that are not biodegradable. So we see the tension between those two. And the son of Uranus and Gaia was Cronus, who is Saturn. And as legend had it, there was a prophecy that his son would dethrone him. So Uranus made sure that he would get rid of all his kids, his male kids in particular, because the prophecy was that they would dethrone him. But Gaia helped Saturn and hid him, and he basically survived. And he ended up castrating his father. There's a whole story about Saturn castrating Uranus and taking over the leadership over all, governance of the gods. And because Saturn is related to karma, the prophecy was also projected on Kronos, and the same thing was said, that one of his sons would also dethrone him. And the same thing Kronos did. He wanted to get rid of all his children so that they wouldn't take over his leadership, and he ate them until his wife Rhea realized that that's not a solution, to have all her children consumed by her husband Saturn. So she hid Jupiter, Zeus, and she gave Saturn a stone. I mean, think of the symbolism. Saturn, Earth, gave him a stone that he swallowed. And when Jupiter was, uh, big enough, became an adult, he indeed defied his father. And there was a long war, and he eventually won. And Saturn, Kronos, as a result of that, um, then ruled over the dimension of the dead. Those who had good karma would actually end up in Saturn's uh, realm and be well taken care of. So it's very interesting, the karmic qualities of Saturn. The other interesting thing, in this transition from father to son, and each son basically having to violently take over their fathers, up to Saturn, the world was governed by what we call titans. So Saturn was a titan, and Jupiter was a god. Now some say, well, the titans were also gods, but there's a different terminology in the mythology, because there is a shift. In the world of Saturn, when Saturn and Uranus were the leaders, they were supreme leaders, and they would basically um, the rules were the rules. So everything was fated. There weren't many dramas, or not as many dramas, because things were in order. It was of a higher order that everyone responded to. And when Jupiter came along, we see the free will factor coming in. And even though Jupiter, Zeus, was a supreme leader and was also governing over everything, he did share governance with two of his brothers, Hades, Pluto, who was governing the underworld, and Poseidon, Neptune, who was ruling the seas. So they divided, the governance into three, but Zeus had the upper hand. He was, the main decision maker. He could veto everything else. So we see again the presence of Jupiter and Zeus, um, the big prominent light in the sky. And as far as light goes, in astronomy goes, Jupiter is the third largest light, I mean, in the night, not counting the sun. After the moon and Venus, Jupiter is the largest, the brightest light. So Jupiter, most prominent wife was Juno. And that's why I'm going to talk about the asteroid Juno and the relationship between the cycles of Juno and Jupiter. And you'll see that it actually affects relationship quite interestingly. So we'll explore that dance of Juno and Jupiter and the big, father and mother in the sky, the queen and the king. And Juno is particularly relating to relationships, but it has other layers as well. Jupiter, Zeus, is also the father of Athena. And I'm focusing on Athena, even though, oh, everybody's related to everybody in the Greek mythology. But there's something very interesting about Athena is that she was born from the head of her father. So she was not born through her mother, and she was not born through the genitals, the birth canal. She was born directly from the head. And Pallas Athena, she was a warrior goddess. And she represents, the intellectual woman, the woman who will not follow uh, the traditional feminine roles. Basically, she defies the stereotype of the wife, of the good wife, so to speak. Now, the reason why Athena also adopted the name Pallas, Pallas was actually her stepsister, because as she was born from Zeus, Zeus didn't take care of his kids, so she had a trainer, someone who would take care of teaching her the arts of war and battle. And that particular trainer had a daughter named Pallas. And there was a bit of competition between Pallas and Athena. And Pallas started to get better than Athena and kind of overpowered, not in a bad way, but she was just, more skilled. And Zeus saw that his daughter was not the best. And so he distracted Pallas during their training. And as a result, Athena accidentally killed Pallas. Um, and she was so, she was grieving that. And as a result, she adopted the name Pallas and added it to Pallas Athena. And in astrology, we use the asteroid Pallas Athena. So it's after that fusion. Um, as we said, brother Hades and Poseidon, Neptune and Pluto are close brothers of Zeus. Now, the reason why we talk about the mythology is obviously because we derive a lot of meaning. There's these myths capture a lot of what happens in our psyche. These are primordial forces that we all resonate with. These are archetypes that, consist and constitute uh, all the fabrics of our lives. But on the other hand, I personally don't want to completely rely on the mythology to get all the answers about the influence of a planet. For example, I see Neptune after, and most of you know that I've done, 15 years of research on Neptune. I don't see Neptune matching the myth of Poseidon so closely. So there are some themes, Neptune is the oceans as well, so it also rules the seas and the womb in that sense. But there are many aspects of Neptune that in astrology that don't necessarily match the myth of Poseidon. Poseidon was much more aggressive. and war oriented, and Neptune is much more, the more timeless quality of our experience. So the same with Zeus. We understand there's a reason why these myths exist, and that the fact that the astronomers name the planet after these gods, we rely on the synchronicity of these associations, but we need to do our research to actually see how much of it completely matches. And as we've said earlier, there are many cultures that looked at these planets and created myth that have a lot of variation, and I would say different layers. So I encourage you once again, not as you do your own research and study, not to lock yourself into the myth only. Um, but it's interesting, if we look at Jupiter and we see that chronology from Uranus to Saturn to Jupiter as the leaders, there's definitely a lot of tremendously important um, transits between the cycles of these planets. They are all relating to governance, as we know in astrology. Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto relate to the society, to our conditioning, to what we define as good or bad. So they are the agents that give us reference to our morals, to our conducts, to what represents success in our lives. We say, well, Jupiter is going to come, and I'm going to have a transit of Jupiter, and I'm going to get a promotion, and I'm going to, be more successful. But what is success? What determines success is what we want to better understand, because we are conditioned by our society. Success in the Western world is having a lot of money, and being intelligent, and having power in quite often a financial aspect of it. So these three planets definitely have a very important role in determining our good, bad, and our what motivates us in life, what we want to achieve, and what is considered acceptable, successful, and good in general. So, we grow from Jupiter to Saturn to Uranus, and then eventually to the Neptune world. But there's also, in the story of creation, we go both ways. We go clockwise and counterclockwise. So while there is a natural progression from Sag to Capricorn, there's also a natural progression from Pisces to Aquarius to Capricorn. I'm going to go here to this wheel. So, the nodes, for example, progress clockwise. They go from Pisces to Aquarius to Capricorn and so forth. So that's kind of the order of the Greek mythology, from Uranus to Saturn to Jupiter. And then all the planets move counterclockwise from Sag to Capricorn to Aquarius. So nature and the archetypes that in our development actually go from the collective, oh God, of Pisces to the individual of Aries. So we start from the big picture and then we gradually descend into matter until we reach us, the individual, the particle. But then we can start from the particle and grow to become everything. So I hope that makes sense. I just want to see if any of you has any questions so far. Okay. Everything is clear then. So continuing to look at the different aspects of Jupiter, the cycle of the planet, Jupiter stays 7.5 months up to 13 months in a sign. So all planets do not have an exactly symmetrical and round orbit. They have an elliptical edge. And this is why Jupiter can come closer to the Earth through some signs and then slow down again. When it's close to the Earth, it's going to go faster through the sign. And then it slows down again. And up to 13 months, which is a year and a month. Now, the way it works is that Jupiter will move into the new sign in proximity to the sun in that sign. Usually no more than a sign away from where the sun is. So, for example, Jupiter is going to move into Capricorn on December 2nd, 2019. So that's Capricorn, and the sun will be mid-Sagittarius around that time. And then it's going to move into Aquarius December 21st, 2020, which is again a sign away from where the sun is. And last year it moved into Sagittarius when the sun was in Scorpio. So the sun is always around the planet that moves to a new sign for the first time in its cycle, sometimes in the same sign. So that's why it stays 13 months. You see that it stays 1 year plus a month and it moves to the next sign, 1 year plus a month, following sign. So the sun is always keeping up with Jupiter's progress. However, when it reaches its cycle where it's very close to the Earth and it speeds up through the sign, then it is not moving into the sign at the time of the sun. The last time this occurred in our current cycle was in 2010. Jupiter was in Aries for just a few months. About 3 months was in Aries in the middle of 2010, then retrograded back to Pisces the end of 2010, and then leaped forward into Aries in January 2011, and then just raced through Aries and stayed there for just 4 months. So it stayed 3 months in 2010 and 4 months in 2011, not even completely together. And for a total of 7.5 months. Then it moved to Taurus and stayed a little longer in Taurus, and then, you know, returned to its more regular cycle. And so the sign that it stays the faster in, that it stays the least in, changes each cycle. So this time was Aries, the next time is going to be Pisces, the next time is going to be Aquarius. Keeps going back, retrograding into that fastest progression through the sign. Does that make sense? The best thing, you know, for you to grasp this is to actually look at the ephemeris, do your homework there, and look at what happened, you know, in 2010-11 when Jupiter was in Aries, and then see what happens next time in 2022 when Jupiter is going to be in Pisces. It's going to also go very quickly through Pisces this time. And then 12 years from now, it's going to go very quickly through Aquarius, and so forth. The total cycle of Jupiter is almost 12 years. It's 11.8. And that's a very, very important thing, because the law of 12 is so important in our world, and especially in astrology, you know, 12 signs, 12 years. It describes how Jupiter is basically capturing that natural order of the zodiac. And that's, you know, that's why it is such an important reference. Even Chinese astrologers, you know, the Chinese system gives very strong importance to Jupiter because it follows the year. It's about 1 year in a sign and 12 years total. So they also have a 12-year, 12 animals, 12 archetypes. And so this takes us back to the sovereignty that Jupiter represents, of that natural order. You know, going through a Jupiter cycle is like going through something that is very complete, that is very fulfilling, and like we said, a reference to our development. And we're going to see that there's something very particular about our experience of Jupiter returns. So 12 years approximately, you know, through all the signs, about 1 year in each, more correctly, it's 7.5 to 13 months. And then it retrogrades for about 4 months in each, you know, in each cycle. So the time it retrogrades is usually when it trines the sun. So now, for example, Jupiter is in Sagittarius. I'm going to actually show this to you so you can have a better visual. Let's do 2018 to 2021. So we're going to look at, you know, the sequence of the retrograde cycle. So you see Jupiter, and on the 1st of January 2018 was in Scorpio. The Sun was in Capricorn, obviously. Now, if we move forward, I'm going to move my screen here. If we move forward, we're going to see that Jupiter started to retrograde in Scorpio on March 10, 2018. So it turns retrograde when it is trining the Sun. The Sun was 19 Pisces, so it's about 115 to 120 degrees distant from the Sun. That's when it starts to retrograde. And then it's retrograding until it goes direct on July 11th. And here the Sun is in Cancer. So the second trine is when it gets out of the retrograde. Well, again, about a distance of 115 to 120 degrees, it changes direction. So when it's in a water sign, it's going to start retrograding when the Sun's in a water sign and go direct when the Sun's in a water sign. The opposite, obviously. It's in Scorpio when retrograde when the Sun was in Pisces, goes direct when the Sun's in Cancer. And then, it goes direct to forward, moves into Sagittarius on November 9, 2018, when the Sun is 16 degrees Scorpio, so a distance of 14 degrees from the Sun. Now, just as the retrograde cycles are important because they trine the Sun, it's very important to look at when the planet, in this case Jupiter, conjuncts the Sun and when it opposes the Sun. So it's going to oppose the Sun when it's in the retrograde phase, in the middle of the retrograde phase. But then it will conjunct the Sun, and the last time it did that, let's see, around November 27, 2018, the Sun was 4 Sagittarius, Jupiter was 4 Sagittarius. So Jupiter moved to a new sign. The Sun is close by, but when it actually conjuncts the Sun is a very important initiation time. So that was November 27 last year. So let's move forward to our current cycle. Jupiter is in Sag, so it's going to probably retrograde when the Sun's in Aries and go direct when the Sun's in Leo. And so it is here. Jupiter retrogrades on April 11 when the Sun is 20 Aries, and it goes direct on August 12 when the Sun's in Leo. And it's going to move forward now into Capricorn on December 2nd. It moves into Capricorn when the Sun is 10 degrees Sag, so about 20 degrees away. And we have to see when Jupiter will actually conjunct the Sun in its cycle. And that will happen on January 3rd, 2nd and 3rd, when the Sun is 7 Capricorn, Jupiter 7 Capricorn. So mark that degree and mark the date and see what happens in your life if there's any important decision made that day, because the Sun and Jupiter, are the two big, kings in the sky. And when the planet conjuncts the sun, it gets the blessing for its journey. This is the time where you have an audience with the king, as those of you who are familiar with my teaching, we've been talking about that. And so January 7th is going to be, the kind of the ignition time of this cycle, really. And then it's going to obviously retrograde now when the sun's in Taurus and go direct when the sun's in Virgo. So I hope this makes sense. Again, if you have any questions, you can email me or you can ask it now. So as Jupiter, is about 12 years, it takes 2.5 Jupiters cycles to have a Saturn return. And it takes 3.5 Jupiter returns to have half of a Uranus return, which is around age 42. Jupiter has completed 3 returns and half, which means it's going to oppose itself. And that's going to coincide with Uranus opposition, half a cycle of Uranus. So about 7 Jupiter cycles equal 1 Uranus return. And that's age 84, which we're going to see. 7 Jupiter returns equals half a Neptune cycle. So Neptune opposes itself around age 84 when Jupiter has completed the complete thing. And about 13 to 14 Jupiter cycle for Neptune. It's not a precise because Neptune, is also 13 point something. It's not exactly 14 years. So as far as ages go, there's something so interesting. The return, you pay attention to the returns and the opposition. So you have the first Jupiter opposition at age 6. It's going to be, opposing the natal Jupiter in your chart. And that's when you go to school. That's usually the age for first grade. Then around age 11, not 12. Around age 11, you have your first Jupiter return, and it continues into age 12. So, but the first hit, the first return is before the 12th birthday. And because, it goes back and forth in retrograde, you continue to experience the Jupiter return in your 12th year. But then the following years, the following returns are going to be 12 years from age 11. So your Jupiter years are 11, 23, 35, 47, 40, 59, 71, and 83. And it extends into the following year. So it's a mistake to think that you count from only 12, you count from 11. And, interesting things, obviously, age 11 is when you become sexual. Usually you're hormonally ripe, between age 11, 12, sometimes 13, even though today this keeps changing and it seems like children become sexually mature earlier than what used to be. But there's a lot of brain development. They're talking about more gray cells and more white cells, which basically represents the, hitting puberty and starting to make our own decision. this, starts to coincide. This precedes our Saturn opposition, first Saturn opposition at age 14. So we have a Jupiter return at 11, 12, and a Saturn opposition at age 14, which really set the tone for our adolescence and puberty. And then again, a very important opposition at age 18, around age 18, when we end our school years, high school, and hopefully graduate. And this coincides with the nodal return as well at age 18 and a half. So it's not a coincidence that our school years is actually from one Jupiter opposition to the next, our 12 school years. Age 23, 24, we usually, depending on where you live, you usually, after college or in college still, and you start to get work, to be part of society in a functional, productive, in an active way. Age 35, 36, that's the beginning of what we call, the midlife transition. You start to ask yourself more questions about what you want to do with your life. Who are you? What's important for you? And that continues until age 42. So at age 35 is when we have the Jupiter return, and that coincides with a Saturn square. And this whole midlife change completes around age 42 with the second Jupiter opposition and Uranus opposition. Now, age 47, you have your fourth return, and age 47 is a Mars synodic cycle. 48 is a Venus synodic cycle. So you're going to have a more Martian version of that Jupiter and a Venusian version of that Jupiter in between 47 and 48. And, I can give you a personal example here because I'm exactly there. I'm ending my 47th year and starting my 48th year. And so this whole year I've had my Jupiter return and I've traveled like crazy, more than usual, at least I think. And also expanded to new territory. I taught in 5 different continents this year. Like it's something different than my usual crazy schedule. So there was something very active, very Martian, conquering new territory and being on the go a lot. And because my Jupiter is in the 6th house, so it has to do with work. So let's hope next year, as it's a Venus cycle, I'm going to relax on the beach and drink carrot juice. Opposition at age 54. That's, kind of an important time for your second career. Usually people, go through an important cycle in professional development around that age. But then the big next step is going to be age 59, 60, because your 5th Jupiter return is going to coincide with your 2nd Saturn return. So you basically experience a Jupiter and Saturn return around the same year. And there's no way your life's going to remain the same. So age 59, 60 is a super important milestone. It's usually not when you retire, because now we tend to retire a little later, but it is about what you want to do, with this next phase of your life. So people go through fundamental changes around that time where they make decisions about moving, changing career, divorcing, new grandkids, whatever your life is at, wherever it's at this time is going to be very important. Now, if you have grandchildren around that year, it means that they're going to have the same Saturn Jupiter as you, which obviously has a karmic resonance. Opposition at 66, and then another return at 71, 72, which I'm going to expand on maybe a little later. But the most important cycle that comes after that in this whole series of return is age 83, 84. That is going to be your 7th Jupiter return, and it completes a synodic cycle with the sun. So we may say that, the larger Jupiter cycle is actually 84 years. What does that mean, a synodic cycle? It's the dance between Jupiter and the sun. So even though, Jupiter returns to the same place every 12 years, it has a relationship with the sun. This means that when you have your birthday, your solar return at age 83, you're going to simultaneously have a Jupiter return. They're both returning to exactly the same ratio, the same places. You do experience that at age 47 with Mars. That's why I say it's a Mars year, because it's a synodic cycle with the Sun, Mars, and 48 is with Venus. Every 8 years, actually, you have a Venus synodic cycle. But with Jupiter, it's 83 years. And so if we're lucky to live healthy until 83, we'll have many stories to tell. But it certainly, brings a sense of completion. And it's such an important cycle, because not only is it a synodic Jupiter cycle with the sun, it's also a Uranus return. So the Uranus return corresponds with the Jupiter synodic cycle. Now, think again, go back to the mythology and remember the relationship between, Jupiter being the grandson of Uranus. And it happens to be a Neptune opposition as well. So what does that mean? What happens during these returns? That's what we're going to explore, because we want to interpret that in our charts. So getting to our keywords, let me you see, we want to understand the meaning of a planet. Where do we start? We look at the mythology of its name. We look at its astronomical cycle, and then we also look at its placement in the zodiacal wheel, especially for these planets that rule a sign. What does it mean that Jupiter is between Saturn and Pluto, Saturn and Mars, if you use traditional numbers? So the actual placement of Sagittarius in the wheel is very important when we derive our meaning. So just a quick, recap of the different quadrants. You have the first quadrant from Aries, Taurus, and Gemini that relates to incarnation, becoming self. So it's the survival quadrant. It's where you gather all your resources. That's how you basically get in touch with who you are and make sure you survive the elements, survive the challenges of life. So Aries, Taurus, and Gemini work on your strength, your spirit, Mars, your strength of spirit, Taurus and Venus, your physical strength, which includes your material assets, and Gemini is your mental strength and your ability to figure things out and solve problems as you face all kinds of quandaries in life. So these three signs are your weapons. They are your assets. They help you make it and find yourself. Then you have the second quadrant, the Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Moon, Sun, Mercury, which are the production, it's the production quadrant. That's when your ego is now established and it's creating, it's doing something. So that second quadrant is about your own personal mission, your meaning in life. So people with this quadrant tend to be very creative, goal-oriented, and very in touch with themselves. Like they know what they want, they know how to get it. They don't compromise, and they use the resources from quadrant one to now make things happen, lead, and that's why it's a phase where we're giving a lot, producing a lot, and very inspired. We feel so inspired. This is also a phase where we are control freaks because we know what we want, we know how to get it, and we don't compromise. So it's really up to us. This is where people, want to manifest their destiny, their mission. So the moon is, getting you in touch with who you are. The sun is actually the creative mechanism. And then Mercury is the integration, function, and application of everything you want to produce. Then you move into the third quadrant and first one above the horizon, into Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius. And this is where you realize that even though you are so skilled and talented and you can survive and you're strong, you need to keep growing. So it's the growth quadrant. And how do you grow? You grow by meeting other people, and you suddenly see that, oh my God, I don't have that, and I don't have this, and I want that. So you get to a point where you're not satisfied with your life, and you're in a constant search to expand, to grow. So you start to face a lot of challenges in this third quadrant, and a feeling that peaks in Scorpio where you defeat it. This is why the eighth house in Scorpio is such a bitter pill, because you feel like you have to face all your limitations. You face your crisis that force you to grow. So in Libra, you're interested in growing. You say, oh, I'm like that, and I like this. And maybe I can consider, learning something from you. But then in Scorpio, it's like you don't have a choice. If you don't grow, you're going to die. And this is why it's the secondary ruler of Mars, because you are reignited. You're ignited in the first house and you're reignited in the eighth house. If you do the transformation work, if you are able to increase your strength. So the strength that you had in the first quadrant is now weak, and you need to change to reclaim your strength. So Pluto is that descent into the into the cellar, into the underground, so you can see what's under the surface, all the things that you have avoided that need to be addressed. And then you reach, Sagittarius, which is the fruit of your expansion. After you've grown and you've, went through all these challenges and made all these effort, and you extended your lease in life through Scorpio, you're now, feeling so masterful because you see that there was so much more than you initially anticipated. That's why there's a square between Virgo and Sagittarius, because in Virgo, you think you figured everything out. I'm strong, I do what I want, I'm in control, I work hard to get what I need. So Virgo is like, work hard, you'll get there. But Sagittarius is like, hey, look outside your window. There are so many things you're missing. And so, there is that dynamic of holding on to who you are and what you have versus taking risks and going beyond yourself. So Sagittarius is kind of reaping the rewards of everything Scorpio did. After all the emotional crisis, you have shattered those windows, you blew through those doors, and you see that you get in touch with an important word for Jupiter and Sagittarius, with the potential. Like, there's such a potential. It's like tapping into a new oil reservoir, right? If you're drilling for oil and you didn't realize that there's so much more, you thought you were running out. And so you have now energy for 2 more centuries. So, that's one aspect of Jupiter, but it's not the only thing that happens in this transition. When you look at Scorpio, it goes through, this intense confrontation with everything that's not working. It's a crisis point. That's why Scorpios are change maker. That's why Scorpios are detective, because they immediately see where things are not working and they anticipate the crisis before it comes. So they're really working hard to be equipped emotionally, psychologically. That's why Scorpio doesn't trust easily. It needs to really see if you mean what you say. So Scorpio is essentially an emotional sign, and it's going through an emotional transformation, and an emotional transformation that gives a sense of power. So if the transformation is successful, what you will see in the life of a Scorpio is that they start their life as reject. Nobody wants to be with them. They don't shine. They're intense, angry, and they fail a lot. And they're not the popular, boys and girls at school. But then they, because they face all these insecurities and rejections, they start to work on themselves, and they start to, get smarter, wiser, faster. And they transform themselves to become the hot product, the one that everyone wants to be with. the one that everyone wants to employ. You know, they win the market emotionally and practically. That's usually you're going to see these phases in strong people with strong Plutonian and a Scorpio signature. Is that they go through, an early stage in their life where nothing, where they're a failure and when nobody wants them. And then they transform into being magnetic, being wanted, being popular. Um, it's a Napoleon complex a little bit. So when we reach, the Scorpio transformation, we also reach the point where we went deeper. But the next step that Jupiter really imposes on Pluto and Sag on Scorpio is that it's not enough to grow psychologically, to grow um, emotionally. You need to now develop yourself spiritually. So you enter through Sagittarius, which is the last fire sign, you enter a new phase. We talked about quadrant, but now we can divide also the zodiac in tiers. So you enter the last third of the zodiac, and each third starts with a fire sign. So this last phase of growth in the third quadrant is where you grow not only physically, not just in the material world, not just in the emotional world, but in the spiritual world. And so you reach a new frontier. And what is the spiritual world? What does that really mean? I mean, that's a question I could ask you guys. Okay, someone raised their hand. Okay. If you can just type your question in the chat box, it will be easier for me to see it. Find the meaning of your life. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So yes, what is actually the difference? What happens is that you start to move through Jupiter to a transpersonal approach to life, to a more global perspective. So up to Scorpio, you're mostly dealing with you and who's around you. So you're dealing with your environment, you're dealing with your personal life. When you move into the Sagittarian realm, you start to look at things from a more holistic, global perspective that encompasses not just those that you are familiar with, but everyone. Life. You start to see life as a complete organism, and you transcend your personal uh, your personal circumstances. But what is interesting is that Jupiter is on the one hand a fire sign. I mean, ruling Sagittarius, it's a fire-related archetype, which is very personal. And yet it enters the transpersonal realm. And there's that constant conflict between Jupiter, in Sagittarius, navigating that frontier between the self and the collective and the global. And you'll see the two types of Sagittarian and Jupiterian expression. Some of them will be on a lower frequency, which will be more self-oriented, whereas other will be more transcendental. But in one way or another, the meaning of Jupiter is to take you to a more global meaning. So what you're basically doing now through this phase of Sagittarius is that you're going beyond what is physical, what meets the eyes, into the world of abstract theory, philosophy, potential. So something that's not yet materialized. And that is, that's why Jupiter becomes so, think about the structure of Jupiter. It's a gas giant. It doesn't have real substance. There's no solidity on Jupiter. And there's a lot about that in, in its expression. Yes. So the transition here is from an emotional Scorpio to a spiritual perspective. How do we get spiritual? Sometimes it is through pain. Think about how many people, open up to spiritual dimensions because they went through some kind of difficult crisis, a loss, or a loss of meaning. Their life doesn't work anymore, and they want to know why. And that's what happens. And then you complete your Jupiter cycle, and you experience this sense of increase, this, I think all of you can identify with the fact that if you've had a spiritual awakening, it was such, an ecstatic experience. It puts you in touch with, you know, with something that is of lasting meaning and such a deep resonance. You get in touch with something so precious, so vast, and it's bliss. So there's ecstasy in that spiritual development. And today, many people use mushrooms or ayahuasca or different plant medicine to access those realms. And they have downloads and realizations, which is interesting because quite often this, especially ayahuasca, is a very Plutonian experience of purging. You vomit your soul out. And then you have these realizations. So it's very Scorpio Jupiter. You need to do a lot of internal, there's a lot of internal discomfort and purging to get to that place of realization. Hopefully you get there, because some people get stuck in the lower, in the difficult emotions. So moving into, the fourth quadrant, that's when you move into the realm of Saturn and Uranus and Neptune, and that's what we talked about earlier, the Titans. So what happened in the world of Titans is that it's the end of free will. You enter the domain of higher order, fate, what is beyond your ego. And you get also what is beyond your time. Even though Kronos and Saturn represents time and milestones, it actually opens us to the transcendental time of the impersonal place between the material dimension and the spiritual dimension. Saturn represents karma because it represents spiritual justice. Karma is not about the government. It's not about the police force. It's not of the material world. That's the spiritual dimension of Saturn. It has to do with spiritual justice. The fact that if you are misaligned and if you are a liar and you keep winning on other people's back, there are consequences. And where are these consequences coming from? Who's deciding that there's a consequence to cheating? Like, nobody caught me, so I should be fine. So the fact that there are karmic repercussions shows us that there's an intelligence that's beyond our police system and governance, beyond the material world. So don't, some people say Saturn is like limitations and it's the very physical world. It's not just the physical world, it's also the spiritual order and spiritual justice. So, then we move to Uranus. Uranus represents spiritual awareness. It's the ability to know the unknown. And that's why, it captures the genius. Uranus is your antenna into the reservoirs of the absolute. So it's your ability to, to understand things that are of a vaster nature. And beyond that, it's the ability to bring them back to the earth. So in a typically Uranian way, you travel the sky, you study astrology, you go into space, you see the infinite. Even though you're not traveling into the other galaxies, they are there. So this world is an infinite world of expansion. And so that's why, Uranus represents that enlightenment. And then Neptune is the all, the everything, the beyond the personal, what is beyond time. Now, what's interesting is that Jupiter is the first step in this transpersonal sequence. And so there's something very liberating about Jupiter. But there's also something very liberating about Saturn and about Uranus. I mean, we know that Jupiter and Uranus in particular are the great liberator of the zodiac. But how do they work differently? I'm going to expand on that when we go to, our third session, talk about the planets and their own cycle. But think about the fact that Jupiter is a fire principle and Uranus is an air principle. So one of the forces of Jupiter is actually as a third fire sign. It's a sign of creativity. So we talked about these different quadrants. Now let's talk about the different tiers. So starting from Aries, the first fire sign, all the way to Cancer. Aries is the ignition. It's when your spark of life is ignited and you open your eyes and you're born, you exist. Then the sun and Leo is about you igniting others. That's why it has to do with children. And you were, in Aries you were created, and in Leo you now create. So you become the master, you become a demigod, and you manifest your destiny, you give what you were here to give. And then Then you reach Jupiter, which is the third, Jupiter and Sagittarius, the third fire sign. And here, what you realize is that what you've done, what survived, has proven to be valid. So you created things through Scorpio, through Leo. You became the god yourself. You became the leader. And through Virgo and Libra, you started sharing and creating all that. But then in Scorpio, we see what survived. Did your creations actually make it? And if they did, then you reach the milestone of Jupiter, which is your grandchildren. So through Jupiter, we see what you harvest from the sun. Now, if your kids are screwed up, you created kids, but they're thieves and liars and they're unhealthy. So your Jupiter experience is going to be a difficult one because you have the consequences. The results of your creation is something that is not healthy, that is not productive. And that becomes a very toxic Jupiter. But if what you created, was successful and polished and a complete, then your Jupiter becomes rewarding. And that's where you have, satisfaction from your grandkids, meaning your kids are now producing. It's not just you producing kids. How do you know you're successful? Is if your creation creates. I hope that makes sense. So this is why there is a distribution quality to Jupiter. Jupiter represents the expansion mechanism. We talked about the need to expand into the spirit, into the potential, into the abstract. But Jupiter is also, once you've passed the milestone and the initiation, it is an initiation, it's a shamanic ritual. That's why Jupiter is, that all these milestones in your development, schooling and puberty and so forth. When your product is good, you're ready to sell it. You're ready to sell it everywhere. It's the dissemination process. Let's say I wrote a book through my solar quality. Now that book is going to be, a source of inspiration for my students, and it's going to be a reference book in some schools. So it starts to have a life of its own. And that's when you see that your original seed, original ignition, is leading now through Sagittarius to an empire. Everybody refers to you. You've conquered the hearts, the minds, and the soul of other people. So that's why Jupiter represents that reward of growth. But as I said, it's not unconditional. It's not necessarily a given because what Jupiter can teach you, if you have a Jupiter transit, you suddenly get bad news or you suddenly have a crisis, it's because something in the earlier stages of creation was not properly managed, and you're now getting a feedback, from your kids or your grandkids, or from the results of your sales, that it didn't work out properly. So as you reach now the Jupiter realm, you can tap creatively, because it's fire, so you tap through your creativity into the global. And that requires a certain amount of humility. And this is where many people misuse their Jupiter and their Sagittarius, when they become overly personal with the energy of Jupiter, which wants to step into the transpersonal. In a very simple way, that's when fanaticism is coming up. What is fanaticism? Religious fanaticism, spiritual fanaticism, any kind of compulsive, you know, converting mechanism. When you tap into something spiritual, but you become so emotionally, you start to own it. You want to own the spiritual truth. So you don't know how to balance the personal and the transpersonal, and you're basically taking authority, ownership over these larger truths, and you become, a maniac, so to speak. So you lose that perspective, and you think you own the truth. So understand why that happens. It's that difficult transition between the fire, which is very about your own birthing process, your fire in a reality that is global. And then you reach Saturn, which is the higher order, the spiritual justice. And Saturn is going to be an indicator, obviously, of what works and what doesn't. Now, the thing with the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn is very interesting. Remember that they are, it's the prince and the king, and the prince wants to become a king. So Jupiter is the attempt to take over Saturn, and it's a big battle. But they also work together. So when Jupiter is the expansion mechanism, Jupiter says there's more to life than this. And we all agree. Life is not just what's in front of us. It's not just the material and the physical. There's meaning. And when we have a spiritual awakening, that meaning comes to us. We have these aha moments. We have a truth that is being revealed to us. And so we try to push our boundaries. We want to know how far we can go. If my book is successful, maybe I can, sell it in Russia. There are many people living in Russia. I should open that market. Or maybe I'll translate it to Spanish and then sell it to the whole Latin culture. So that these are all Jupiterian goals and themes that from one book you can create hundreds of others, hundreds of thousands of others, and touch the collective. But in that particular process, you can also go too far. And that is an important Jupiter law. When you basically, um, sorry about this, you basically need to risk failing in order to grow. So Jupiter will naturally push the boundary much further than they can. Because if you say there's more to life than this, how far do you know it goes? What is more? Is it twice more, 3 times more, 10 times more? So you need to test it. And so you're going to produce, 10,000 books. But then you only sell 5,000. Then you have an extra that is not sold. So that's part of the Jupiter mechanism, that you need to overdo things in order to recognize the new reference. And when you do that, you can grow up to that point. So, okay, I didn't sell 10,000. I only sold 5,000, but that's a gain of 5,000. So I know now that I can increase my production, at least to that level. And so as you go through the cycles and you go through your Pluto transformation, you go through another leap of faith where you say, okay, maybe now 7,000 and maybe now 20,000. So each time you go through the spiral of the zodiac, there's a new inspiration to push it a little bit more and a little bit more. And so with that dynamic, you naturally are going to have waste, because not everything is going to prove successful. And in this wasting process, you risk creating karma. That is one of the functions of Jupiter. As much as Saturn has to do with realigning yourself, understanding that there's a higher purpose, that you can't just do what you want, Jupiter is about saying, I need to try. Think about this. Ages. Age 6, you have a Jupiter opposition. Age 12, you have a Jupiter return. These are ages where your kids are going to try to take more authority and to defy you. And they're going to think that they're invincible, that, hitting 12 or 18, they feel like they know everything, and they can tell their parents what to do. Necessarily so, but then the parents are either, stepping back and saying, okay, I don't need to keep my kids on a leash. They know, they're fine. Or my kid must go to school. They think they don't need school, but yes, they do. So then there's a Saturn component that comes in and realigns the Jupiterian kids that just, wanted to do whatever they wanted to do. So there's that, the kid needed to push the parents' buttons to see how far they can expand their authority in themselves. But as they do that, you step on other people's toes, you waste resources, you fail at your initiatives. And so through Jupiter, you're creating a lot of karma that you will need to rectify at a later stage. So that's why, karma, good karma, bad karma, it's really inevitable. It's a natural law. You do need to make mistakes. You do need to mess things up because that's how you learn. That's how you grow. The question is how much. And if the question is how quickly your Saturn kicks in to bring you back into alignment. Now, when Saturn brings you back into alignment, it doesn't necessarily bring you back to the place you started. If your parents kept you on a leash and you went through your Jupiterian expansion and you said, I can do everything on my own. You don't need to hold me back. But then you did many things and then you failed at some things. So your parents are going to rein you in, but they're not going to take you back to the initial point. So you're going to have a longer leash. That's what I mean. They're still going to keep an eye on you. They're still going to ask you, how much money you're making and if it's really working out for you. And they're going to test that, you are actually producing what you are promising. What I'm saying is that you see that relationship between Saturn and Jupiter, which leads to constant development and maturation. And in your own physiognomy, Jupiter and Sagittarius represents the pituitary gland, which is the actual physical growth hormone, comes from the pituitary gland, as well as the aging process. So your growth and decay come from the pituitary gland, and they're both ruled by Saturn and Jupiter. Jupiter also rules the liver and the pelvis and the lower back. So the connection between the animal and the human. The symbol of the Sagittarius is that centaur, half man, half horse, and they connect on the lower back, and that's where the pelvis is. And this can be a place where people experience sometimes chronic pain when they have strong Sagittarius or Saturn Jupiter aspects, because dislocated pelvis or difficulty being in touch with ourselves, with our animal selves, is also part of that lower back pain. Now, obviously, the horse is very strong with Jupiter, but the eagle is also strong with Jupiter because in the mythology, Jupiter had Aquila, the eagle. It was his companion. And it's interesting that in the sky, the constellation of Aquila is right next to the constellation of Sagittarius. Did the astronomer know any astrology? Maybe. So let's work on our keywords. Wherever you have Jupiter, you have sovereignty because you pass that milestone. There's something accomplished there. It's what you read from your sun. So you get to a point where you have a certain level of confidence from all your past life work and experiences. It's your grandchildren. It's not just fun to be with your grandkids. It's a sense of satisfaction that you contributed to this world and that there's something that will outlive you and that they are doing okay. So there's a sense of mastery and completion. And because you are in that place, there's also a feeling that you want to share that. So there's a distribution quality to Jupiter. I want to share my news. I want to share my wisdom. I want to share my product. I want everyone to benefit from the source of this project. So there's also the sharing through teaching, through wisdom, through academia. So there's a lot of, the Jupiter is the teacher because they need to share the truth, the knowledge. At the same time, like we said, because you are now tapping into higher frequencies and you realize there's more to life than this, there's a daring quality. The expansion to a new frontier, which we said can lead to mistakes. Now, the universe has the function of a rubber band. So you can stretch it to a certain degree and then it bounces back to normal. But in that stretch, it means you're pushing things farther and farther. And if you push too much, the rubber band's going to break, and then it's going to just jump on your face and be painful. But what I'm saying is that the universe tolerates mistakes. Otherwise, every time, if you were living in a purely Saturnian world, the Chronos world, if you were to make a mistake, you would die immediately. Every mistake would lead to death. It would not be tolerated, sustainable. So the fact that the universe, that we are allowed to learn from experience and fall on our head and, stand up again and pick up where we started, all, these mistakes show that the universe has a degree of flexibility. And that's a Jupiterian principle. The need, I will say even a fire principle, because all fire signs are going to shoot and try and push, and they're not, they're going to test the boundaries. The question, will you be addressing where Jupiter's place is a place of where you lack confidence and belief in yourself? I mean, there's no guarantee that you have confidence. Wherever you have your Jupiter is what we call a potential. So yes, we're going to address that for sure. And like we said, it's also the results of your failures. So there is definitely hard truth to Jupiter. Importantly, it's also where you can create karma when you push too hard and too strong and you're not able to rectify your mistakes. You create damage. Jupiter can have damaging consequences. And one example, many dictators have Jupiter on their nodes. It's part of that bulldozing quality. Hitler had Jupiter on his nodes, and Stalin had Jupiter on his node. So you see that these were not very friendly people, but they had that Jupiterian overconfidence. They pushed their boundaries too far to a point where it created damage. And you see that became a source of karma. The transition to the spiritual plane and this ecstasy of awakening. And then how you deal with your spirituality, how attached you are, what is your attitude to your beliefs, that whole transition between the personal and the transpersonal. The role of spirituality in your life, what drives. Now, going back to our wheel, think about the fact, we talked about that fire triangle. You're ignited, you're created in Aries, you ignite others, you give, and you give birth in Leo. And through Sagittarius, you share, you expand your reach, and that's why it's a conquest is in Sagittarius. But there's another aspect, as you transcend into the spiritual realm, you create your meaning. You find your meaning in life. So what's important with Jupiter is that we need to understand how it goes back to Aries. Do you have any idea? It's an open question for now, even though we're running a bit out of time. How do we go back from Jupiter to Aries? Or Sag to Aries? No takers. So what happens is when you understand life and you have a higher meaning, you are motivated. You become a human with a spiritual philosophy. No. What you do basically, yes, you are a human with a spiritual philosophy, but the Aries principle is the action principle. So basically, once you have a wider perspective, you have an ideology, you have a spiritual meaning, that's what motivates you to do, to fight, to wake up every morning. So Jupiter is the motivation of Mars. It's the goals. If I believe in astrology, Jupiter, I'm going to create workshops and I'm going to start a new business. I'm going to do all these Martian things because Jupiter gives me a sense of meaning, and you continue that cycle again over and over again. So it's your inspiration. This is why the negative side of this is when you have religious war. So you have a religious ideology and you're using force to impose it on other people. So going back to our keywords, what drives our action? Jupiter represents what drives us. What fuels our Mars? It's the fuel of Mars. And then the truth, the no compromise. Now remember that because Jupiter represents this higher realization and higher meaning, it takes us closer and closer to the Pisces truth, to the secondary ruler, that which is timeless. And this is why Jupiter can also bring very shocking truth to our life. Like, suddenly you get the news that your business is going bankrupt, or that the tree is going to fall on your house and you have to do something about it. So during Jupiter transits, you can actually get facts that prompt you to have to do something about your life because there's a tree that's going to fall on your roof. It can be a shocking truth. It can be an inconvenient truth, but it's ultimately about a liberating truth. So there are two hard pills to swallow with Jupiter. One is when you reap the benefits, the results of your efforts, and you see that it wasn't adequate. And so you don't get along with your kids and your work doesn't pick up. And instead of expansion, you have a contraction. So Jupiter can also bring contractions. not just Saturn. And then the shocking truth where you want to know more? Are you sure? Are you sure you really want to expand yourself? Take this. So sometimes it is about a more challenging truth that you need to internalize. So I'm going to send you this PowerPoint so you can review it. And tomorrow, as we're going to start putting Jupiter in the signs so that we can integrate all this and see how it really works in our charts. So thank you in the meantime, and hope this speaks to you.